The disappearance of 24-year-old Daniel Robinson in 2021 was very mysterious due to the bizarre events which led up to it and the even stranger occurrences that would take place after the fact. Daniel Robinson was a native of Columbia, South Carolina, and he was the youngest of 4 siblings. Growing up, he had many friends and was very close to his family. Daniel was born with a condition that left him without part of his right arm, but this never slowed him down. After school, Daniel decided to become a geologist and enrolled in the geology program at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. Just months after graduating from the school with his geology degree in 2019, Daniel had been offered a position with Matrix New World Engineering, an environmental engineering company. This position required him to relocate across the country to the city of Tempe in Arizona, about 2,000 miles away from his hometown. Although Daniel was excited to be starting his career, no one could prepare him for the unforeseen circumstances which would befall him. June 23rd of 2021 began like any other day for Daniel. That morning, he would arrive at his worksite in Buckeye, Arizona at 9 a.m. in his Jeep SUV. Upon his arrival, he was greeted by Ken Elliott, a technician who was employed by Weber Water Resources that Daniel had never met before. His company worked alongside Daniel's, and together, the two were tasked with assessing a remote drill site that day. It's important to note that the following story is Ken's account of what happened on the 23rd of June, as he was the last person to have seen Daniel. According to Ken, they began their work and everything seemed normal for the first 15 minutes. Ken said that initially Daniel appeared fine, but out of nowhere, something had suddenly changed in him. Ken claimed that Daniel had undergone a complete shift in demeanor from one second to the next. He also mentioned that Daniel had become very distant.
Daniel started to stare off into the desert, and he was just turning in circles. So he would look off to the north at a distance and then turn and then stare off into the east, out into the desert. And he just kept turning around in circles and doing this. I didn't know if this was a medical condition or what.
Then, without warning, Daniel suddenly turned around and walked back over to his Jeep. Ken thought he was just getting something from his vehicle until Daniel put on his seatbelt, turned on the ignition, and waved to Ken. He then proceeded to drive off towards the east. Although what happened with Daniel was strange, Ken just assumed that he wasn't feeling well and would call in sick when he got home. Unbeknownst to Ken, however, the day he met Daniel would also be the last day he would ever see him. According to Ken's account, he informed Daniel's company about the situation shortly after he left. They told him he could continue working, so he proceeded to do so for the next few hours. By 3 p.m., Daniel had not called in sick or checked in with his employer, so Ken decided to follow his tire tracks out into the desert. What Ken discovered while following the tracks made his heart sink. They took him to a T-intersection where a left-hand turn led to the city and a right-hand turn led further into the desert. He saw that Daniel had made a right-hand turn, meaning he had continued into the open desert. That was the moment Ken realized Daniel had not gone home that day, at which point the whole situation became far more unsettling. After seeing this, Ken quickly alerted his employer and Daniel's company about the situation. One of Daniel's co-workers called Daniel's sister, Devisha, who also lived in Tempe, to see if she knew anything regarding his whereabouts. She told him she hadn't seen Daniel in a little while. Devisha proceeded to call her and Daniel's father, David Robinson, to inform him about the situation. David asked her to go to Daniel's place, to which she obliged. Unfortunately, he was not at his apartment and was not answering his phone. At this point, David contacted Daniel's company and spoke to Ken, who told him the story of Daniel's abrupt departure from the worksite. David then called the Tempe Police Department to tell them his son was missing, but was redirected to Buckeye because that is where the disappearance happened. Buckeye PD informed him that they did not have to search for Daniel immediately since he was an adult and he would have to wait at least 12 hours. David made many calls during that time to try to get information about Daniel. He realized, however, that he would have to go down to Arizona himself because he was too far away to do anything. On the 24th of June, David Robinson left South Carolina for Arizona, where he would eventually relocate. Once in Arizona, David started reaching out to anyone he thought could help in finding Daniel. At the same time, he was working with the Buckeye Police Department to get information, such as cell phone pings, and organized numerous searches for Daniel alongside them. He also notified Tempe PD because even though Daniel's worksite was in Buckeye, he resided in Tempe, Arizona. Over the following weeks, David conducted many searches of the area where Daniel disappeared, some private and some with the help of police. Unfortunately, however, he never managed to find anything useful. It seemed as if Daniel had dropped off the face of the earth, until about a month later.
Daniel was last seen on June 23rd, but his Jeep Renegade was discovered overturned in a desert ravine almost a month after he disappeared.
On July 19th, a rancher found Daniel's damaged Jeep rolled over on his property with the airbags deployed. The scene immediately stood out as bizarre. All the clothes Daniel was wearing on that day of his disappearance had been found scattered around the vehicle. His work boots, work vest, jeans, and shirt had all been discarded. His phone, wallet, and keys had been discarded as well. This left investigators with numerous questions. At what point did Daniel remove his clothing? Was it even him who did it? If it was, why would he remove all of his clothes in the desert after crashing his vehicle? And most importantly, where could he have gone? He had no shoes or socks on, and he left the water bottle he had with him at the crash site, meaning he would not have lasted long in the desert heat. The whole scene was extremely bizarre and didn't seem to add up, according to Daniel's father, David. It was also perplexing to him that the vehicle was found in an area that had already been thoroughly searched days prior. 1 week after the discovery of Daniel's Jeep, it was turned over to David, along with all of Daniel's belongings. The fact that Buckeye PD handed over the evidence so quickly suggested that they didn't find anything suspicious about Daniel's disappearance and were not investigating it further. David, however, suspected something may have happened to Daniel and was unsure why Buckeye PD wasn't treating his disappearance seriously. Since David believed Buckeye PD didn't do a thorough job in their investigation, he decided to hire private investigator Jeff McGrath for a second opinion. David gave McGrath every piece of evidence he had, which included Daniel's vehicle, everything in it and around it, as well as a 40-page crash data report obtained by Buckeye PD. A crash data report is a report which details a car's movements before and after a crash, such as how fast it was going and what time the collision occurred. What McGrath discovered on the report was shocking and left many more questions than answers. McGrath found that the Jeep's airbags had not been deployed after it rolled over, but they had actually been activated sometime prior. According to the crash data report, the car was involved in some sort of collision about 4 hours after Daniel left his worksite and then traveled another 11 miles before ending up in its final resting place. The initial collision happened at 12:54 p.m. Since Daniel's car was found less than 3 miles from his worksite, Buckeye PD said this 11-mile discrepancy was merely an error in odometer readings. Their stance was that the vehicle had only crashed once, which was when it rolled over. McGrath, however, firmly believes that the car was involved in a collision before it rolled over and that it did actually travel the 11 miles. One reason for this is the fact that the vehicle had damage on it that was not consistent with the terrain where it was found. The information in the crash report added another degree of mystery to this case. If the data was valid, why would Daniel have continued on for another 11 miles after crashing his vehicle with the airbags deployed? What made him crash in the first place, and why would he not have called for help after? Investigators, as well as David Robinson and Jeff McGrath, all had their own theories regarding what happened to Daniel. After Daniel vanished, some investigators pointed out events in his personal life which seemed to indicate that he was going through some sort of mental distress. Their primary evidence was the interview of a woman named Caitlin, who decided to remain anonymous. Daniel worked for Instacart in addition to his main job to earn some extra income. On the evening of June 12th in 2021, less than 2 weeks before he vanished, he was delivering food to 2 women in Phoenix. Once he arrived at the house, one of the women by the name of Caitlin invited Daniel in for a drink. According to her account, they chatted for some time. By the end of the night, they had exchanged numbers. Caitlin further told police that she sent Daniel a podcast later that night over text and he replied with the word "hi," but she did not answer, and that was the end of their conversation. In Caitlin's mind, their encounter was friendly, but she believes that Daniel may have seen it another way. She went on to show police some text messages Daniel had sent her in the time after he had met her, leading up to his disappearance. On the 14th of June, Daniel texted Caitlin that he had forgotten something at her house and asked if he could return to get it. Caitlin responded the following day and told him that he could whenever he wanted to. By the time he replied to her text 7 hours later, however, she had gone out of town. Daniel had messaged her that he could be at her house later that night or the following afternoon, but since she knew she wouldn't be home, Caitlin didn't reply. Despite this, however, she saw Daniel through her front door camera later that night, knocking on the door and looking through the window to see if she was inside. Although Caitlin did tell Daniel he could drop by whenever, she expected him to at least text her before he showed up at her house. This would not be the last time Daniel appeared at her house unannounced. According to Caitlin, Daniel showed up to her home another time on the 17th. She made it clear to him over text that she didn't want him to show up to her house and that it made her very uncomfortable. Daniel apologized, but proceeded to send Caitlin odd messages over the following days, such as one saying he loved her. On the 21st of June, Daniel texted Caitlin to ask how she was feeling and showed up to her house yet again a few hours later after she explicitly told him not to do so. They exchanged a series of texts where Caitlin was telling Daniel that what he was doing wasn't right and he was responding to her in a rather strange fashion. The very last message that Daniel sent to Caitlin came on the 22nd of June, and it was perhaps foreshadowing what was to come. Daniel texted, quote, "The world can get better, but I'll have to take all the time I can, or we can, whatever to name it. I'll either see you again or I'll never see you again," end quote. Buckeye PD took this last text, as well as the way Daniel had been acting in the weeks before his disappearance, as a clear sign that he was under some sort of mental distress. Their belief was that Daniel walked out into the desert and succumbed to the elements. The police department did not even entertain the idea that something might have happened to Daniel. David Robinson, on the other hand, doesn't believe that Daniel's behavior had anything to do with his disappearance and that the texts are simply a red herring. It didn't make sense to him that Daniel just got to work at 9 a.m. on a Wednesday, suffered some sort of episode, and drove his car off into the desert. Furthermore, if he succumbed to the elements, how has he not been found after so many searches? Jeff McGrath and David Robinson believe something far more sinister could have happened to Daniel. According to David and Jeff, the most likely possibility is that some sort of foul play happened. One theory is that Daniel might have been purposefully or accidentally struck by a target shooter. The area around Daniel's worksite was a known target practice zone. Many of those in search parties assembled for Daniel reported hearing frequent shooting around that area when they were looking for him. Before the search began, they were even warned that there was a chance they could get hit by someone accidentally and that they would be searching at their own risk. As such, there's always the possibility that Daniel may have been struck and the individual responsible attempted to stage the scene. While this is a compelling theory, there are some factors regarding the case suggesting that this wasn't some random accident. A few months after Daniel's vanishing, a group called Daniel Robinson Missing was created on Reddit. Several threads have been posted in this subreddit detailing oddities surrounding Daniel's case. One Redditor suspects that the last person who ever saw Daniel might have something to do with his disappearance. In a thread titled "Debunking Ken's Story" about his interactions with Daniel the day he went missing, a user points out the fact that, according to the official police report from Buckeye PD, Ken changed his version of events when speaking to different detectives. Ken was interviewed by 2 detectives on separate occasions over the phone and gave both different stories. First, there was a time change. Initially, Ken stated that he and Daniel met up at the worksite at 9 a.m. and Daniel had left at 9:15. He mentioned this to a detective over the phone on the day Daniel disappeared. The following day, however, on the 24th of June, Ken had spoken to another detective, and this time he claimed that the two had met up at the worksite at 9:30 a.m. and that Daniel left around 9:45. While this is only a 30-minute discrepancy, it's peculiar that Ken would mistake the times, especially considering he was interviewed on the same day the disappearance happened. While it could be argued that Ken simply misremembered the time, this was not the only part of his story that didn't add up. According to the police report, Ken also gave varying accounts of the weather that day. During the first phone interview, Ken told the detective that it was raining around the time Daniel disappeared. The following day, however, he claimed that it appeared that it was going to rain. Many believe that Ken could not have misremembered such a detail. Many also tied Ken's varying version of events to a man named Bill Hayes. There was another thread posted on the Daniel Robinson Missing subreddit about the involvement of a man named Bill Hayes. In a video about Daniel's disappearance posted in September of 2021, a man named Bill H. left the following comment. In it, he details his alleged encounter with Daniel. According to him, he ran into Daniel around 2:30 p.m. in the desert, looking for something in the back driver's side of his Jeep. He claims he asked Daniel if the location was shooter-friendly, but did not mention any further conversation. At the end of the comment, he mentioned that he was in the process of contacting Daniel's search organizer, private investigator Jeff McGrath, and was waiting for a call back from Buckeye PD. Shortly after posting this comment, David and Jeff met up with the man in person, who introduced himself as Bill Hayes. Bill told them that he was some sort of federal agent and went over his version of events. He was also later interviewed by Buckeye PD, who deemed him a reliable witness. The problem with Bill's story about encountering Daniel in the desert, however, is that it does not add up. The most glaring detail that stood out was the time that Bill alleged to have seen Daniel. He claims it was at 2:30 p.m. when he and Daniel crossed paths. According to the crash data report, however, the record shows that Daniel's Jeep had crashed at 12:54 p.m. and the airbags were deployed. Bill made no mention of any damage to the vehicle in his comment or subsequent interview with police. If Daniel had crashed the Jeep nearly 2 hours before encountering Bill, how could he possibly not have noticed the damage done to the vehicle or the fact that the airbags had been deployed? This almost certainly proves that Bill didn't actually see Daniel in his Jeep that day. This was not the only part of Bill's story that seemed to be fabricated, however. According to police records, Bill was not a federal agent at all. He was actually a repeat offender who had numerous run-ins with the law since the age of 19. Most recently, he served a 2-year sentence for trafficking marijuana and was released sometime in 2018. Not only did Bill lie about what happened that day, but he also lied about his identity. What benefit could he possibly have derived from lying about seeing Daniel the day he vanished? The Redditor who created the post believes that it could have something to do with Ken. According to the user, one possibility is that Hayes was set up to take the heat off Ken by saying he was actually the last person to have ever seen Daniel. If a random passerby saw Daniel hours after Ken claimed to have last seen him, Ken's name would be in the clear. While there isn't any evidence linking Bill to Ken, why else would Ken have reported a false sighting of Daniel? At this point, it's unclear why Bill Hayes' involvement has not been examined further. It's also unclear why Buckeye PD didn't even want to consider a potential criminal element behind this case. It is important to note, however, even if foul play sounds like a plausible explanation in Daniel's disappearance, there's absolutely no legal proof tying either Ken Elliott or Bill Hayes to the vanishing of Daniel Robinson, and their involvement in this case is merely speculation. Furthermore, there are no good theories as to why Ken would have had a motive to do something to Daniel. They were only co-workers, and they had just met. Regardless, while there isn't anything concrete proving that Ken Elliott or Bill Hayes had any involvement in Daniel's vanishing, one cannot deny that the fact that the inconsistencies in the two men's version of events are, at the very least, suspicious. There's been no additional evidence discovered since the disappearance of Daniel Robinson, which might provide a clue as to what happened to him. Many searches have been conducted in the area where he vanished, but none have been fruitful so far. The case is less than 2 years old, however, and as such, it is still very much ongoing. David Robinson constantly updates viewers regarding his son's case on his channel, Please Help Find Daniel. He also runs a website with the same name, as well as a Facebook and Twitter account. If anyone has any information regarding Daniel's case, David can be contacted through his website.